plastic frame.
Hello. Hello. It is 7 p.m. on Wednesday. As always, we'd like to welcome you to a Wednesday special edition support group. This is on intrusive thoughts. We always like to give a couple minutes for people to get in and get settled. Hey, Haley, how you doing? Hey, Jackie, thank you. So we'll always give it a couple minutes. In the meantime, please let us know you're here. Say hello. Let us know where you're coming from. We always like to give shout outs, and we will just hold for about 90 seconds and then we'll get started. We have a really, really great panel today. Hi, Grace. Good to see you. Great panel, great discussion. So yeah, it's going to be good. Usually I make up things now to look busy and feel important. Hey, Katie, how are you? Hey, Thomas. I do. I like look around. I'm like, working. Okay.
Shuffling
but really, but I'm playing with my stress toy. But see down here, it's like, very busy. So this is great. We have Thomas. She's here. Katie is in Austin. Grace, my girl, Nikki in Ireland. Samuel from Toronto. Allison's in Minnesota. You guys are pretty close, no? We're Toronto. Aren't you close to Canada?
Yeah. I started close to Canada. Minnesota as a whole is, yes.
Yeah, I was right. Okay.
You were right. You were totally right. Yep.
May have to step out early. Will this be taped and available later? Depends. Are you leaving? Yes, it will. This is all recorded and will be available both on the IOCDF Facebook page and YouTube page. So, and hi, Grace from Michigan. Adam from Bethlehem, PA. Oh, hi, Jay. Oh, Adam. Adam says hi, Jason.
Hey, Adam.
Minnesota is close to Winnipeg.
Yes.
See, I know my Canadian geography very, very well. Clearly, I'm crushing it. So
you're in Georgia, which is really close to Maryland. You're right by Massachusetts.
Yes. Right.
Yes.
Very close.
Just on the map, just circle it. We have David from Cottonwood. We have another Torontoian.
That sounds
Torontarian. I think it's Torontarian.
Torontarian?
I just made that up, but yes.
Oh, Mel's here. Hi, Melanie from Northern Ontario.
Hi.
Rich from Houston, my hometown. We got Marty from DC. Great. We have a good group today. All right, so let's get rolling. We want to always reward those that are popping in and saying hi. We got a good group. So my name is Ethan. If you don't know me, I'm the National Ambassador for the International OCD Foundation, which simply means I have OCD. I like to talk about it way too much. Clearly, if you've been tuning into these over the last 5 weeks, you've been seeing a lot of my face. For that, I'm sorry, unless you enjoy it, and then I'm not sorry. Either way, it's a good exposure, or you're just enjoying this. So thank you for being here. This is a special edition. We've been doing family support at this night, but we heard you. We know that you wanted to talk about intrusive thoughts. I have intrusive thoughts. I know Allison has intrusive thoughts. Probably about me. Regardless, we do want to be here and let you know that we hear you, we're available to you, and make sure that we are here to support you and answer your questions during this time when we know, regardless of what the intrusive thoughts are, that times are unprecedented and unusual and can definitely be a trigger and a spike for a lot of you, including myself. So Grace, Ethan equals the king of live streams, does like 100 a day. Thank you, Grace. That made me laugh out loud. So with that, I'm going to just quickly start by introducing our panel. We've comprised a very, very brilliant panel for you, and then we'll start with some intros, and then we'll get right to your questions. I do want to quickly say, though, that this is an intrusive thoughts support group and panel. If you came expecting a kids, we did not advertise kids, but if you did expecting a kids, feel free to stick around. But I will say, though, that we definitely want this to feel like a safe place where any of you can ask questions, and if you need to get graphic in some way and talk, whether it's violent or sexual intrusive or whatever you want to talk about, if there's kids watching, just that's a warning that this is specifically geared toward intrusive thoughts. So watch with your own parental discretion. With that in mind, let's get started with our guest tonight. To my left, but right facing, is Jason Krompinger. He's the Director of Psychological Services and Clinical Research at McLean Hospital OCD Institute, which I frequented quite often in 2010 and 2011, and is an instructor in psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. So Jason, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Jon Hershfield, just below Jason, is the Director of the OCD and Anxiety Center of Greater Baltimore, located in and Teletherapyville, Maryland. He is the author or co-author. Well, which one are you? He is the author or co-author, we're not sure, to be determined, of When a Family Member Has OCD, Everyday Mindfulness OCD, Overcoming Harm OCD, and the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD. John, I'm detecting a theme.
Indeed. Hi, thanks for having me.
And last but surely not least, we have the quite lovely and adorable Alison Dotson. Alison is the author of Big Me with OCD, How I Learned to Obsess Less and Live My Life. She was diagnosed at age 26, which is only a few years ago, after suffering from taboo obsessions for more than a decade. Alison is the president of OCD Twin Cities, an affiliate of the IOCDF, and the recipient of the 2016 International OCD Foundation Hero Award. She's spoken about her experiences with OCD with several media outlets, including The Atlantic, Glamour Magazine, Good Housekeeping, Health.com, and NBC. She lives in Minneapolis, which apparently is nowhere near Toronto, where there are 2 rescue dogs, Tuffy and Gracie, who make her laugh every day. Hi, Alison.
Hi, thank you.
So let's get rolling. We have a great audience today. I think we're up to 83 or 100 people. So let's lead off with you, Jason. We know that there's an uptick in intrusive thoughts, specifically related to COVID and everything that's going on. What have you been experiencing in your own practice, and just some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing that I've been seeing by a lot of people, certainly some intrusive thought stuff related to COVID itself, but actually the bulk of my practice has really been people struggling with just the isolation and quarantine component of it. And, just this idea that there's so little that we can actually do. We're spending all this time at home, spending all this time really not able to do even some of the many coping skills that we might normally do. And what I've really noticed, and a lot of the folks I've worked with notice, is how insidious OCD can be. So I've had people who have, for example, lots of intrusive harm thoughts, particularly when it comes to being in close proximity to people. So you think in a way that, if they're not in close proximity to people, they're not triggered. And it's like, well, I'm kind of on vacation from my OCD a little bit. And it's like, I'm fine. I'm kind of like cruising. But a lot of folks are noticing just the ways that OCD can kind of twist and turn and kind of contort itself to fit whatever the situation is. So, folks who, so they're not at work and they're not having intrusive thoughts necessarily of impulsively assaulting a coworker or something like that, but they're home and they're on Zoom meetings and they're having intrusive thoughts. Well, am I sort of assaulting them, via the Zoom? Am I having the wrong kinds of intrusive thoughts as I'm interacting with someone in my meeting, and they can tell, and that will kind of bring with it its own catastrophic outcomes. So, being sort of like very aware and impressed, if that's the right word, with kind of just how OCD can sort of like fit itself into whatever the circumstances are. And it sort of helps, I think, to inform then what the treatment, which we'll talk about, I guess, probably later, should really be about in terms of really getting at that sort of underlying core fear. And then just real quick, just the last thing I've just noticed a lot along the same lines is with all this isolation, in the kind of social distancing and all that, there are just new kinds of rituals that can pop up too, where, maybe there are fewer things to check if you're not, or fewer things to avoid because the avoidance is sort of imposed on you if you're not actually around people. But just the ways in which OCD can kind of create new ways or sort of push for new things to do mentally or otherwise to try to reduce the uncertainty, control the feared outcome in some way. So I think a lot of folks are just kind of being increasingly aware of the kind of the reach of the OCD, and it's been an important sort of theme of our meetings as far as kind of adjusting the treatment to sort of be on top of it.
Thank you, Jay. It's really interesting because it definitely brings up, or at least highlights, this idea that really, this is going to sound extremely morose or negative, but in terms of OCD, when you're looking for relief and treatment, there's really no escaping it, right? Yeah. We want to run from it. We want to, if the house is contaminated, we want to move to a new house. If this is that, and really the only way is to face it head on. So this has created circumstances where everything is unprecedented, and yet OCD is finding ways to get creative and make people uncomfortable, which then basically means that we have to turn to what we know, which is evidence-based treatment and exposure response prevention. That's a great point. Just so everybody knows, we are predominantly making this a question and answer. So if you haven't already, go ahead and load your questions into the live comment section, and we will absolutely start answering them one at a time. We're just going to finish up these intros. So, John, along the same lines, what are you seeing? What are you experiencing? Give me a little insight into you.
Well, OCD is a jealous disorder, right? It doesn't like when other things are taking up a lot of your attention. It always wants to be center stage. So it's being upstaged by this, behemoth that's floating around called the pandemic. And so I'm seeing people kind of go in interesting directions. I mean, I agree with everything that Jason brought up. I'm seeing a lot of that. I'm seeing a lot of moral obsessions, just excessive concern about whether I'm feeling the right feelings or thinking the right thoughts about this pandemic. I'm enjoying my time home with my kids, but also people are dying, and how dare I feel good while this terrible thing is also co-occurring. And on the identity front, whether it's sexual orientation obsessions or harm obsessions, with some, it's this pressure of, okay, now I'm trapped alone in my house with nothing but my thoughts and I have to figure it out. Or maybe the world is ending, and so if I don't figure it out now, I'm never going to figure it out. So there's this additional pressure to ritualize. But I'm also seeing people go in the opposite direction, which is there's something so big and so real and so present in my life in this pandemic that maybe I don't have time to figure out this OCD. Maybe I don't have time to do my rituals. Maybe seeing the difference between this existential quandary of am I this or am I that, as compared to this thing that's actually real and actually there, is helpful for some people to say, you know what, that's not worth my attention. This is worth my attention. Or maybe neither of them are worth my attention, and I should just, pick up a book or go exercise or do something else. So I think it's easy to forget when you have OCD, whether you've had treatment or not, that you're more than just your OCD. Even if your whole life is devoted to OCD treatment, if you treat OCD, or if you've been in treatment, if you're an advocate, if you write, whatever it is, it's still just one aspect of your experience. And this pandemic is a mental health challenge for all people. Like, we're all facing a mental health challenge. So those of us with OCD are certainly going to be expressing that challenge and the pressure that it puts on us in OCD ways, but also in other ways. Because if you tell somebody they can't go hang out with their friends, or they can't go to work, or they have to follow all these rules, you're going to see an increase in just symptoms in general, whether it's depression, irritation, and things like that. So I think it's important that we remember that this is just a really challenging time. It's just an unusual stressor, and we're all going through it. And so if your OCD is going in this direction or that direction, it doesn't say anything really all that important about you. That's just one way that you're manifesting the stress of this very big deal.
Thanks, Jon. I appreciate that. Jason, Scotty from the Bronx says hi. He has the same last name as yours. I'm guessing. No,
it's a coincidence.
Oh, total coincidence. Okay, cool.
My twin brother.
Oh, that was Jason. I was like, I have relatives in New York, but they're not in the Bronx.
So, Alison, my dear. So before we get started with you, I just wanted to give you a shout out. That Jackie Wolford just wrote, I'm excited because I was planning to look Alison up after the OCD documentary yesterday because I felt so connected to her OCD story. So you have a fan in Jackie.
Thank you.
So Alison, from a lived experience perspective.
Look me up.
From a lived experience perspective, how is all of this affecting you? What have you been seeing in individuals that you've been talking to? Fill us in from that perspective.
Sure. So I really struggle, or have struggled, with intrusive thoughts, and my compulsions have largely been mental. So this whole idea of being scared of contamination isn't something I'm used to. What I will say is that the negative impact for me, because I've been working from home for, I think, 5 or 6 weeks now, I can't even remember, is that one of my compulsions is to avoid situations that make me anxious, to nap instead of facing reality. And I just have all the time in the world to do all the things I'm not supposed to do. I'm basically getting permission from my governor to not go places, not see people. So that, I think that that's not healthy for me. And I'm trying my best to still maintain some healthy behaviors. I am lucky enough to live in Minnesota, as we talked about. I live in Minneapolis, but it's an area where I can easily take a walk with my dogs. And if I need to, I can cross the street. Like, I'm not in an area where if we all go out at once, we're going to be elbow to elbow. So I can still do all those things. I will say I've had more of an uptick in feeling like I could be responsible for getting someone sick. And of course, I could get someone sick. And I mean, that's like, I think different from what we're used to with OCD is that our intrusive thoughts, our obsessions are usually irrational. I mean, yes, there's like usually a kernel of truth. So this is a little different, but just that idea, if I don't have my mask secured correctly, or if I go at the wrong time, or like, do I really know what 6 feet is? I don't think I know what 6 feet is. Like, I'm 5'2". That's not that far. I'm trying to figure all this stuff out. But I have heard a lot from people just saying like, they actually feel like they're coping really well because OCD and learning to face uncertainty has prepared us for this moment. And I think like, I feel, this moral scrupulosity that Jon talked about, like I feel bad that I'm not more anxious because people are dying and people are sick. And then there are people, on the front lines of treatment who are risking their lives. And I'm like, well, I'm great. This is fine. And that's not a great feeling. So that's where I am. I don't know how much longer like I could, in a healthy way, handle being so isolated.
I appreciate your candor, Alison. I really do. I really appreciate your honesty and rawness. I think a couple of things. I think that from the beginning, and this is just my own personal opinion, we can agree or disagree. I think that people made the mistake of saying social distancing instead of physical distancing, because that's really what we're talking about is physical distancing. I think social distancing gives us more permission to isolate. But I also want to throw a quick follow-up to Jason and Jon Cohen as well, which is, so there's this idea, this conversation is this, well, now there's this viable threat, there's a real thing. And so is it OCD, is it not OCD? So my question is, well, my position has always been that, the uncertainty has always been there, whether it was before COVID, whether it's now or before, there's always been a million threats. The difference is our government is responding, it's all in our face all the time. So my question is there a difference now? And let's say before this, when Alison maybe could have had an illness and walked by an elderly person that could die from the flu and transferred to her, and it just wasn't in her. Is there a difference right now regarding certainty?
I think I was going to say, like Jon said before, that OCD is a what do you say, jealous illness. I think it's also very greedy. It's a greedy illness. So it wants as much certainty as it possibly can. So, with these guidelines that come out, yeah, they're new. It's a new baseline, right? It's a new reality that we're all dealing with. But the way OCD works is that it hears those guidelines and then it wants you to go the extra step, So it's like, if you wash your hands for 20 seconds, 30 seconds must be better. 40 seconds must be better. Or, I'm supposed to stay apart from people 6 feet. Well, why not 8 feet? Or why just not leave my house at all? And so I think that there's still very much fertile ground to embrace uncertainty within these new guidelines that we have, because OCD will still crop up even as you're sort of adhering to whatever the guidelines are that come across. There's no, I think, added mandate to that folks with OCD are it's not okay for them to live their lives in the same way that other people are living their lives too amidst this. There's no rule that says, well, because I'm thinking about and I'm worrying about this stuff, that I can't still take that walk outside or go to the grocery store with my mask and still, I don't know if it's exactly 6 feet. I don't know. But, the other guy doesn't quite know either. And just because these thoughts are in my head doesn't necessarily make them special and that I have to adhere to them in some way. You're still, everybody, whether you're thinking about this or not, you're still well within your rights to fashion your life within this new kind of reality that we all live in.
Jon, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say that normally something doesn't happen to all of us at the same time, right? So normally it's something happens to other people, right? So something's going on with one of my clients and I'm striving to understand it, but it's not also happening to me. Or there's some terrible war or disease going on over there and I'd like to understand it better and I have a lot of compassion for those people over there, but it's not also here. And so that's kind of presented an interesting challenge for the OCD, because I think that's where a lot of the moral scrupulosity comes up. It's sort of this pressure to not get COVID and not spread COVID, and you're supposed to follow the rules, and if somehow you mess it up, then you failed on a global stage because everybody is dealing with this. And so that's where I think the OCD can get in there. And so that question of, was it 6 feet or not? That's an OCD trap, because that is an area where there is uncertainty, and you absolutely can do exposure to that and say, I don't know if it's 6 feet. Because if you think you're social distancing, you're social distancing. You have a civic duty to not overrun the hospitals. And the OCD wants you to think that this is all about don't get COVID, which is not something you have control over, right? There are a lot of people who have it, who did everything right and got it anyway, because that's how viruses work. So the OCD doesn't want you to know that. It wants you to think that you have this power that you really don't have, to make sure, to carry a measuring stick around with you, make sure you're exactly 6 feet apart, and you have the exact right kind of mask, and you washed your hands the exact right way, the right number of times. And that's a trap. Yes, follow the CDC. Yes, follow the guidelines. But any area where you're not sure if you're following it, you're following it. Because otherwise the OCD is just going to overrun this whole process and make it about OCD instead of about this pandemic that we're all dealing with.
That's a great point. Thank you. Thank you. I want to dive into questions. We're getting a lot of really good questions. So let's roll up our sleeves and get to work, because there's definitely some good ones. So Jess, our first one is Jackie Wolford. Allison, your friend Jackie, at 7:10 p.m. She actually does have a question for Allison, but I'll also obviously let Jon and Jason weigh in as well. Allison, how do you do exposures if the proposed exposure violates your religious beliefs? For example, if you have sexually intrusive thoughts and ERP expects you to flood your brain with said thoughts, but your pastor says that intentionally having sexual thoughts is a sin, how do you reconcile the two? Jess, do you see this question at 7:10? Nope, not that one. That was awesome. So, Allison, what are your thoughts?
Well, I definitely want Jon to take over on this because he's the expert. But I would say is that you work with your pastor, and if you can, to have your therapist and your pastor even talk if they can, and say, like, I don't want to violate my religious beliefs in order to do my therapy, because they're both important parts of my life. Yeah, I guess that's the advice I would give. I'm not going to get into the religious part of it. I'm just going to let that one go, and say that if that's an important part of your life, then it needs to be integrated into your therapy.
Go ahead, Jon.
But Jon, the expert, would you like to weigh in?
You mean I'm the expert because I'm a heathen, or some other reason?
Because you're a therapist. Because you're a man, obviously.
I actually have, I don't know if everybody shares, I don't think everybody shares my attitude about this. I think if you want to have strong pectoral muscles, you can do push-ups. But if push-ups are against your religion, you can do bench presses instead. So there are religions that say you can't make the choice to conjure up and engage with specific thoughts. And whether or not I personally agree with that, philosophically, is irrelevant. Nonetheless, this is the person I'm working with, and this is what they believe. So then the question becomes, well, still, how do we engage ERP? That doesn't mutually exclude ERP. There are ways we can do ERP that don't necessarily involve choosing to conjure up and engage with thoughts. For one thing, we can overemphasize response prevention, right? All of these same religions that say you're not allowed to choose to have the thoughts, most of the religious advisors I've spoken to will say, but if they arise, you don't have to take responsibility for them. You don't have to dwell on them. In fact, dwelling on them would really be the sin, not the thinking, but the fantasizing and this, kind of a processing of it. You could certainly look at it and say, okay, that's a thought and it's uncomfortable. And part of my treatment is to not try to do anything about it right now. And I'm going to try to disengage and pay attention to something else, even while that thought might still be there. And that might feel very sinful because, maybe you're not putting in enough effort or the right kind of effort or something like that. And there's no religion that says you can't do exposure to thoughts of maybe I'm not doing it right, or maybe I'm not, making the right choice. So there's always a way in. Sometimes our hand is forced as clinicians to be especially creative or flexible, and sometimes it isn't, but we just do the best we can. But I don't think there's a circumstance where there's some situation where it's like, well, I guess this person can't do exposure. There's always a way to do it.
Go ahead, Jason. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, just especially on the response prevention piece, there's a difference between scrupulosity and religiosity, being very religious and very connected with your religion. And and scrupulosity, which is really a different thing, right? I mean, it's not really, scrupulosity isn't really about improving a connection with God and improving your faith. It's actually usually driven by fear of God and kind of a perpetual fear of sin. So, you know, the idea of kind of framing these rituals in such a way where, you know, you can do them all you want, but do you feel more connected with God? Do you feel more like you're communicating with God the more you're engaging with these rituals? Like 99 times out of 100, people are saying no. And when I'm actually practicing my faith, which has nothing to do with controlling my anxiety, which has nothing to do with like protecting myself from God, it's more about just improving my communication. That's what actually makes me feel, that's what's better for me. That's why, that's kind of the way I want to relate to religion in my life. So kind of helping to frame for people that scrupulosity really is more about trying to not have a certain feeling than it really has anything to do with actual God or faith. I'll channel and shout out to the wonderful Leslie Shapiro, who's a BT at the OCDI, who says, yeah, the opposite of scrupulosity is faith. It's not unscrupulosity.
I like that. I like that. I also think it's important in exposure therapy for scrupulosity to remember that the goal is it's an engagement with uncertainty. So we want to put people in situations where they might get triggered. That sometimes that, you know, we could say like, oh, let's read this thing that has all these terrible words in it, or watch this movie that's like really a challenge to your faith. But if we can't do that, we can still look at, well, what are you avoiding that other people at the same level of religiosity as yourself, who you trust to follow their faith, you know, the way that you want to be doing it? What are they doing that you're not doing? Because we should at least be able to do that. And it might be something like, well, I don't want to walk down the street because I might see a billboard that has an image of something that might give me a thought. Great. Now we can do exposure walking down the street. I can't tell you to purposely think the thought, but there shouldn't be any kind of rule against that kind of exposure where you're putting yourself in a situation where you might get triggered, especially since when you think about it, the purpose of doing that is so you can practice responding non-compulsively, so you can have a healthier connection to your faith, like Jason was saying. I mean, the whole purpose is to bring you closer to your religious faith in the end, because that's what you're claiming to want.
Faith, by definition, involves uncertainty, right? Just in the word.
Indeed.
And that's a great point, is at the end of the day, it's reconnecting with our values, digging ourselves out of the OCD rubble so we can then, as ourselves, connect in the way we're looking to connect in a value-driven and meaningful way. So great advice. So Jess, Katie Rothfelder, our friend from Austin at 7:10 p.m. Jon, this is directed to you. Oh, I hate when it updates. Sorry, Katie, hold on one second. She put it up, didn't she?
It's in the private chat.
Hold on, I hate my apologies. After so many comments, it adjusts and I lose it. Okay, back to okay, she put it up, great. But here's Jon, can you talk a little bit about the response prevention part of really habitual mental rituals like thought neutralizing or memory hoarding? Are we supposed to repeat the exposure if it happens to us?
So that's a pretty complex question, I think. So there might be many different answers that suffice. I'll just give you sort of my initial response, and apologies ahead of time if I'm not understanding the crux of the question. I think a lot of this has to do with mindfulness, and by that I mean knowing what you're doing when you're doing it. That's really all mindfulness is, right? So a lot of times we are mindlessly engaging in mental processes. We're problem solving, but we're not thinking that we're problem solving. We're doing mental rituals, but we're not sitting there going, I'm doing a mental ritual. There's just this activity going on and we're not fully aware of it. We think we're enjoying a meal, but actually we're covertly doing compulsions. So what you'd want to do is work on a skill set that enhances your ability to be aware of what the mind is doing. So these mental rituals that you're describing as habitual don't seem quite as habitual. They seem automatic, but they're happening and you're a witness to them happening. And then you realize, oh, that was thought neutralization. And I think the question was, do I go back and try to re-engage with the exposure and then not engage with the thought neutralization? That's a tricky one, because that could also become the compulsion, because then you're like trying to make sure that you're perfectly handling your brain, which is a waste of time. So in general, I would say no. I would say catch the automatic mental ritual that happened, note that it happened, and note that it was a ritual, and then go back to whatever you're doing before you got distracted by this whole nonsense that has nothing to do with real life anyway, right? And that is the exposure. The exposure is, maybe I didn't do enough to perfectly wrestle this mental ritual to the ground. But whatever, you caught it, and maybe next time you'll catch it, a half a second earlier. And maybe at some point you'll catch it before it happens, and you'll say, I don't need to do this right now.
Alison or Jason, anything to add? Go ahead, yeah.
I was going to just say, yeah, or maybe you'll never catch it exactly the right way, and you'll just have OCD the rest of your life. That's kind of the thing. And I was it dismissively, honestly. It's like sort of like that can be, just as I agree with everything you just said, John. I mean, like that kind of might be an obsession that you have to sort of work with. I totally agree in that. I think that like the standard kind of protocol probably does say stuff like, yeah, if you catch yourself mentally ritualizing, neutralizing, yeah, go back to the triggering thought and re-trigger, and yeah, that's fine. But just kind of more anecdotally, I guess I feel like more in my practice and the folks that I work with, it's more that it can become itself a ritual, just to sort of keep going back and getting stuck into this loop. Am I doing the treatment right? Am I exposing myself to the right thing? Am I not doing my rituals? And engaging in mindfulness in such a way to be able to just see that process more like as it's unfolding, kind of be a passive observer of it and not participating in it. And again, yeah, as John said, being able to increasingly recognize that from that detached perspective, and then not let it change what you do. Continue to engage forward with your life meaningfully, irrespective of what your brain is doing, especially if it's really kind of pulling for you to figure things out and do things the right way.
I think it also comes down to knowing yourself, and this might be a process that gets uncovered over some time in therapy. If we were talking about a physical ritual where if you touch something you think is contaminated, then maybe you have this ritual to wipe your hands on your pants. And now you've learned that, like, okay, I'm not supposed to do that ritual, because I think that's going to decontaminate my hand. But you've been doing it so long and it's so automatic. So for some people, the answer might be, okay, go back to the contaminating trigger, recontaminate your hands, and then don't do that ritual of wiping your hands on your pants. That's probably true for many people, maybe most people, but there's also going to be some people where a better strategy would be to just let it go. Be like, well, missed that one, right? And just open up to that uncertainty of that sort of inconsistency, because it's also good to not treat the event like it was important, right? That's why you were cleaning in the first place. So it really depends on knowing your own process.
And one just additional thing I'd say is like that treatment isn't a way to not have feelings. So it's like, and what I mean is that, I think that when folks can get, this is just going down to the perfectionism around treatment rabbit hole a little bit, where it's not a way to resolve thoughts. It's not a way to sort of figure out a way to not have to experience whatever your human being experience, corporal being experiences. So that trying to figure out how to do treatment the right way with that end is just going to keep you stuck and in kind of just like this, like just endless loop, which is just inherently OCD. So it's a matter of getting better at responding and navigating your experience. And again, like we've been saying, amidst those, it might be just, I'm not doing this exactly right. And that's okay.
So Alison, let me throw something out at you, which is, you from the documentary, I know that you dealt with a variety of intrusive thoughts from a range of things, and I can let you talk a little bit more of that. But how important was it to you to sort of do the exposure perfectly and to sort of to the point of the question? What was your process in sort of successfully coming to a place where you were successfully managing some of these thoughts?
I didn't feel like I had to do anything perfectly. And I don't know if this is something that other people with my type of taboo intrusive thoughts can relate to, but such a huge thing that had the biggest impact on my life was the guilt I felt from my intrusive thoughts. And I just threw in the word taboo kind of casually. And I know that can have a negative connotation. But what I mean by that is just, it's sexual, violent, maybe blasphemous. And so it's the type of thing that if you were to act on a lot of these things in real life, that would be bad. That would be taboo. That would be illegal. It would be against your religious beliefs. It would be immoral. It would just be against like social norms that, we've all kind of agreed, mostly as a society, like you don't molest a child. Sorry, was that a thing I'm not supposed to say?
No, this is a safe place. Say whatever you want.
Okay. So I had a lot of those thoughts. And like you said, they really ran the gamut. I had a lot of sexual intrusive thoughts, and those even intertwined with my religious thoughts. So it wasn't just like I'm having blasphemous thoughts, like they specifically got religious, where I'm like, do I want to have sex with everyone? Even though I've had sex with no one, you know, it was like very confusing. So when it came to just being diagnosed and realizing I'm not an immoral person, and like having a diagnosis with a label was huge, and having this guilt lifted was huge. So when it came to like the actual treatment, I was game for it. And it was scary, but it was more important to me that I got beyond all those really constraining feelings I'd had before. I don't even know if I've like gotten to your original question.
It's okay. I
And
deviated it. I just wanted some of your insight on your own dealing with intrusive thoughts.
Yeah. And I kind of, something that made me like loop back a little bit to one of the original questions about doing ERP for sexual thoughts or something that's against your religion. It made me think of Lee Baer, who wrote The Imp of the Mind, which is like such a great book for these taboo intrusive thoughts. He had a client who had another therapist who had her write out this really graphic incestual script for ERP. And she was so upset. It was actually really traumatizing. And she's like, I don't understand how this is supposed to help me. And he said, it doesn't have to go to the actual, you know, act that you're afraid that you're going to commit. It could be like, let's do a script about the consequences of those actions if you were to eventually act on them. So like figuring out where the fear is really coming from, like why, other than the fact that these feel wrong, like why are we so afraid of these thoughts? Because if I acted on them, yes, they are illegal. And if I were caught, I would go to prison. If I went to prison, I'd lose my family. My reputation would be destroyed. It's all these other things. It's not necessarily what you think it is. It's like, why am I afraid of what should be a passing thought to begin with? I mean, some comedians make their whole living on joking about that kind of stuff, you know, like it's okay to some people. So I guess I just kind of wanted to address that and say, you know, that's the important part of it is like, how can you do the ERP in a way that gives you your life back in a way? And I think that hopefully you have a therapist who's flexible and will work with you on that a little bit, so it does line up with your values and morals. And if you're not getting that, then that's something to consider.
I appreciate it, Alison. So we have a ton of questions here. I just want to say we're going to do our best to work through them. We want to give everybody exactly the perfect answer. No, we want to do our best to get through and address as many as Jason is. We're going to get through as many as possible, but we will give you resources at the end. I always give out my email, so if your question wasn't answered, we'll do our best, but feel free to email me your question, and I can always email it to Jason or John, and we can get you an answer back. They do charge, but I'll take care of it. So the one to blame at 7:10 p.m., the one to blame, I like that screen name. So how to do ERP with obsessions and compulsions that are so meta, you can't even really describe them. So, so Jess, yeah, the one to blame at 7:10 p.m. There we are. So I kind of understand this, because when you start to get into the existential stuff and you start to get into like your OCD about your OCD about your OCD's OCD and so forth, it starts to get pretty messy mentally. Jason, what are your thoughts?
I'll just give a first, but yeah, I think just, I'm definitely curious to actually hear more of you, what you're going to say, Ethan, too. But I think my first kind of blush reaction is to kind of just take a look at the more concrete, like the building blocks of your daily life. So in other words, a lot of times when it comes to this more meta or existential, if we want to call it existential OCD, or just like hard to describe stuff, the person might be putting themselves in situations where they're more likely to be just kind of lost and all that stuff. And what I mean is that, you know, they don't have a great sleep schedule, don't have a great meal schedule. They're lots of big blocks of unstructured time. That's just sort of like the breeding ground to get lost in all this stuff. So, And sometimes what it could be then is that the exposure kind of gets uncovered by way of what might look just more like behavioral activation for depression, where the more we're just let's do stuff. Like, let's just practice engaging with life and whatever that looks like for the person. And you can start to uncover things like, well, yeah, but if I just do that, if I just, go, I don't know, just go work out or like hang out with a friend or something like that, maybe it feels irresponsible and stuff. But I'm supposed to be like dealing with this stuff, whatever that means for the person. Hard to explain, but like, and hard to quite put my finger on, but I'm not attending to it in the right way. So sometimes as a kind of first kind of like salvo against the OCD, it might just be a matter of, can we create a structure for a day and work on adhering to that, and as irrespective of whatever the inner experience is, and kind of just see what comes from that.
That's great advice, Jason. I'm gonna say something and I'll toss it down to Alison and Jon. From a lived experience perspective, I know that I had a lot of crazy intrusive thoughts. I don't mean crazy that I was crazy. I just mean the thoughts themselves were crazy. But one thing I want to mention, and this goes for me, this may not be a popular opinion, but John Grayson says, and it's research back, that OCD sufferers have three things in common: above average intelligence, above average creativity, and a vivid imagination, which basically means that we're all better than Jason. But at least the three of us here. Yeah. So I think for me, as miserable as I was at my worst, I sort of, for lack of a better, I got to find a better word than what I want to say. I really got excited about how deep and intellectual I could get, and like how just intertwined and woven I didn't want it, but for some reason I was really into my intellect about it and wanted to see how complicated my thoughts got, and then really dive into them and explore them. And I almost was proud of that, and like I wanted to challenge my therapist. And it wasn't, and I think a lot of us like have to, and I only started getting better when I really just stopped really loving my OCD like that, and just realized how much I was actually like inhibiting exposure response prevention and harming myself from moving forward, and be like, you know what? I don't have to prove anything to anybody. I don't need to have the most twisted, sickest OCD in the history of the world. In fact, it's just as common as everybody else's OCD, and start to recognize that my individualism is what makes me special, not my OCD. So I don't know if anybody can relate to that, or Jon or Alison have thoughts of that, but I know I was really into like how deep and sort of corrupted my thoughts could get, and would love to explore that stuff, even though it caused me pain.
Yeah, well, you become kind of enamored with the it's just like that thought. It's just like so evil. It's like so wrong. It's like it's the wrongest of all the wrong thoughts. And I'm just you become sort of self-impressed. I mean, you don't want to be, but
no.
It's kind of like Stockholm syndrome sort of thing, where it's like, that's the devil. You've been controlled and abused and brutalized by this thought process, and to let go of it would feel like letting go of a big part of yourself. And so you become really resistant to some therapist saying, you don't need to think about that. What do you mean I don't need to think about that? Those are my thoughts, and they're special and they're important. And you can't help it because you're just so fused with the OCD. I mean, a big part of therapy is sort of recognizing the difference between you processing information as the individual and you processing information through the lens of your OCD, in these sort of separate ways of experiencing life. Picking up on what Jason was talking about, I love that idea of just living as the exposure, and what that implies is that waiting is the compulsion. So the question was like, how do you deal with it? If you can't even describe what you're doing, probably what you're doing is waiting for something to happen before you live your life, and that's the compulsion. And so how do we practice giving you reasons to wait, and then we don't wait, right? And so tying that back to what you were saying, Ethan, how do we abandon that relationship too early, before you've proved your point that you have the best OCD in the world? You went and got better, and you missed that opportunity to get the award for worst OCD ever, but whatever, you're better. And so that makes it okay, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I think tweezing out, we always say this all the time, but really understanding that you are not your OCD, and your identity is not intertwined with your OCD. It's a disorder and it's a disease, and the two are very separate. And the more you adopt that belief and understanding, the more willing I think it is to tweeze yourself out. Go ahead, Jon.
Well, I mean, there's an irony to what you to all that, which is that you're right that the thoughts can be really interesting and really creative in a horror movie kind of way. And when you're better, you can have those same thoughts and you can kind of look at the OCD and give it a high five and be like, yeah, good one, man. But you're not beholden to it to respond compulsively or to get certainty about it. You can just have the thought and recognize, like, yeah, I've got a very creative, Stephen King, Clive Barker wannabe in my head, and it makes noise from time to time. And, that's kind of a cool thing about me. A lot of people don't know that. And then it's not really your disorder anymore. It's just how you think. And then you're free.
Go ahead, Jason.
I was going to say, Alison made a point a little bit ago about comedians and sort of like using this stuff as material, and something that I talk about with some folks that I work with is exactly what you were saying, but just using that material towards a creative end. So I've worked with people that are actors, like you, Ethan, or writers, and meanwhile they have these horrible intrusive thoughts, for example, about suicide or creating harm, and cultivating this relationship where when those thoughts show up, they respond to them by saying, okay, this is actually, I can use this. I can make use of this information, make use of this material, and I can write on it, or I can kind of incorporate it into my act, or kind of like my work in some way. Kind of can it help sort of just change the nature of that relationship, and it can be sort of like for certain people kind of a cool way to start to broaden their repertoire of responses to these stimuli that are showing up, doing things other than, you don't have to just ritualize. There are plenty of other things you can do in the face of this material, and you could make use of them. If that's.
I had some thoughts. I don't want to get to some other questions. Welcome back, Alison. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, this is a good opportunity to segue. Actually, Jason, as you were talking, I was thinking about, one of the positions I like to take in my own, when I was really struggling, which was like, how is this benefiting me? How does really diving in and exploring these thoughts and analyzing benefiting my life in a good way? And it was sort of that ability to address myself sort of a third person objectively and observe as a curious scientist, which brings me to Stuart's question, which is, I'm practicing ACT and mindfulness. Is this a good tool? Can I get better without ERP? That's at 7:11 p.m., Jess. So I'll toss it off to the experts, but what I will tell you is, so ACT, for those of you who don't know, is acceptance commitment therapy. Mindfulness is mindfulness, but is also an aspect of dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. I can personally speak to my experiences with ACT and mindfulness, and how I responded to those, but I'd like to toss it off. Actually, no, I don't want to toss it off. I'm going to answer this first, and then I'll hand it over to Jon and Jason. So the quick answer to yourself is I really struggled in my own journey with ERP, and in the beginning I really felt that I was treatment resistant and that ERP didn't work for me. Through advocacy and talking with lots of other amazing individuals, I quickly learned that due to my own circumstances, being born with OCD, having 30 years of enabling and reassuring experiences with my family and parents, and really just being a slave to the OCD, it was very hard for me to embrace these ideas of exposure response prevention. Now, it doesn't mean that I didn't do it. I did ERP every day, 5 hours a day, at least for 10.5 months. And then dove in a snowbank and faked an accident and got kicked out of the OCDI. But what happened was Stuart, was that I then engaged in acceptance commitment therapy and DBT, right? And that really changed how I viewed my thoughts, my relationship to my thoughts, my approach to my thoughts, what they meant, how much importance I gave them. And the DBT really helped with my emotional dysregulation, because when I would engage in ERP, I would inevitably be a puddle on the floor just crying and couldn't do anything. And so those actually modalities of treatment, which are wonderful adjunctive therapies, and I'm sure Jason and Jon will talk to that, really actually allowed me to then turn back to ERP and really do it the correct way and embrace it. So for me, it was eye-opening and allowed me to embrace the ERP in a way that has kept me, knock wood or not knock wood, relapse-free for the last 10 years, because I probably use ERP more every day now than any other modality of treatment. Jason, what are your thoughts on doing ACT and mindfulness without ERP, and can that be helpful?
I just don't. Yeah, I loved everything you just said. By the way, Ethan, I think it's a wonderful example of just how those adjunctive treatments can be useful. I don't. When I think of someone with OCD doing ACT, they're doing ERP, and I don't mean what I mean is that by doing ACT, by definition, you are practicing allowing yourself to have unwanted internal experiences. Resisting efforts to control those experiences and making your behavioral decisions based more on values and more on kind of yourself rather than the emotions, and so much of that underpins ERP fundamentally. So, I think that, and that's why I think I'm so high on, as someone who wasn't initially trained on ACT, I kind of came from the very traditional ERP sort of habituation focused model where it was like, do the exposure time and time again until you're 50% better, it's 50% less anxiety provoking, and then you move on to the next thing on your hierarchy and you kind of progress slowly. I think what I love about ACT is that it promotes this just a better relationship with the experience rather than just like, hey, here's the right way to get rid of my anxiety. For some people, doing ERP the very traditional way can be very, very helpful, and it works. It's worked for tons of people, for decades. But I think, especially when it gets to be the more severe cases of OCD, it can be, again, like I'm going to exposure and I'm doing these exposures as a means to solve something, to resolve my anxiety, or worse yet, to sort of like prove that it's not going to, like my bad thing isn't going to happen, or, some consequences is not going to happen, something like that. And ACT provides this framework where, no, it's you do your life, you engage and you move forward meaningfully, and you let your experience do whatever it is that it's going to do. And that is a wonderful recipe, I think, for addressing OCD. So kind of a long-winded answer, but I guess the bullet point version of my answer is like, if you're doing ACT, you're doing exposure in some way. So you're probably going to see some benefit from it.
Great. Go ahead, Jon.
Well, I think the problem here is that Jason said exactly what I wanted to say, and I was all prepared to look really cool with this like revolutionary idea that you're doing ERP if you're doing ACT, but now I can't do that. So I'm just kind of scrambling for something really interesting to say. I could not agree more with what Jason just said. And the only thing I could add to it is that, there's this kind of unnecessary debate between like, habituation is good, habituation is bad, ACT is good, ACT is bad. That's what I like about inhibitory learning, is that it seems to irritate everybody, and I get really into that. I think that the primary difference between mindful awareness and ERP is just that in ERP, you're asking for it. In mindful awareness, you're just receiving it, and then you're not responding with compulsions. And that is a huge exposure, right? You just had a thought about stabbing someone, and you're like, oh, look at that thought. Yeah. That's a huge exposure. You didn't freak out. You didn't seek reassurance. You didn't run screaming from the room. You just sat there and allowed for the possibility that could happen. That's amazing. How is that different from what we might call traditional ERP? Well, maybe in traditional ERP, we might push it a little bit more and say, well, let's bring that thought back. Let's actually look at a picture of the knife, or watch a scene from a movie of someone stabbing someone. Let's say, I might like this. I might be really into this, and feel how that feels. But, even when you're doing ERP, you're still doing ACT and you're still doing mindfulness, because what's the point of ERP? It's put yourself into situations where you feel what it is to feel like when you want to do compulsions, and then be mindful of that. Stay with that feeling. Allow that to be the feeling that you're having. And if it goes away, we call it habituation. If it doesn't, we call it inhibitory learning. And if you go and you live your life, we call it ACT. And it's all just you're allowing for the uncertainty to be what it is, instead of trying to exert control over it. And they're just different permutations of it.
That's awesome, Jon. I love that. Remind me not to have such smart people on next time. It's embarrassing. Quickly, Alison, I got a question coming your way. Danny, I see your question. Quickly, he wants to talk about OCD and autism and Asperger's, and Truth of Thoughts are definitely worth. I just wanted to give a shout out what the link is between OCD and autism. I want to get some other questions. So I want to say, Danny, tomorrow, if you check out the Peace of Mind Facebook page, they are having a webinar with one of their autism and OCD experts that will be addressing all of that stuff. Guys, unless you wanted to weigh in quickly, I was just going to point him there because I think that he'll get a lot of information on that there. But yes, I really need to know what is the link between OCD and autism, Asperger's, and Truth of Thoughts are definitely a problem I've had my whole life.
I think you could do a whole seminar. It's a
That's
fascinating subject. Yeah.
So Danny, definitely go to Peace of Mind and check it out. You can also go to peaceofmind.com. It's a free webinar online, and I think you'll get a lot of great information there. So at 7:13, Shira Fulberg. Hi, Shira. Good to see you. So Alison, I'm going to throw this to you. Can you talk a bit about finding purpose while in quarantine to sort of push back against that feeling that you have to give ruminative thoughts so much significance? So, you know, when suddenly our routine and our usual structure for combating these ruminations and intrusive thoughts is so grossly interrupted as it has been, you know, how have you found ways to cope in healthy ways, and what are some suggestions you have as well?
Sure. If I am understanding what she means by finding purpose, and I think that you need to be a little bit careful about this idea of like, I need to avoid these thoughts or these feelings by doing something else, or even to take this time, because people keep saying like, oh, you have so much time, you can like write the next great American novel, and I've already done that, guys. It just needs to be published by someone. Get it off my computer. But I think like giving back in some way always helps when you're feeling low or scared. And I don't know if that's what you mean, Shira, but I personally have gotten more into like getting back into my blog and making sure that this is one small thing I can do. Am I actually like taking care of people at a hospital? No, I'm not doing that, but I'm contributing something and it makes me feel good. And I think when you're at home and there's not a lot to do because you can't go anywhere, and there's certain people you can't talk to, I always tried to do something that could seem really small, but feels big. Like maybe you're going to wash a couple dishes and you felt a few moments ago like you couldn't even do that, and then you did. Maybe taking a shower. I know that like some of these things can feel so overwhelming when you're stuck somewhere, and it's like, the shower feels so good. Why don't I want to do that? I know it's going to be a good thing like once I've done it, but just like getting off the couch and doing it. If you want to say more about what you mean by purpose, because I think that we don't want to get into like an existential crisis either, where we're like trying to make this moment something so huge, because it doesn't have to be, because it can just be like, let's just get through this and do it as normally as possible so that we don't completely lose it in the meantime.
I think that's great advice, Alison. Also, your sound is kind of going in and out again. If you want to pop back on and pop back off. Hey, it's real life. It's real life. We have to remain flexible. Speaking of flexible, thank you for the transition, Alison. So I'll let Jason and Jon weigh in. Finally, we're rid of her. No. So she bought the whole. You know what, Jason? You kind of look like Jason Statham a little bit close up.
All right, that's good.
Good. Doesn't you see it a little bit? I didn't see it before, but now that he's a little bigger, it's a little Statham-y in there. You know, the other thing is, you know, I think that hi, Alison, welcome back. I think that we all have to remain extremely flexible in this time. So OCD loves rigidity. Rigidity is OCD's best friend, right? And one of the best ways we can combat OCD is flexibility and remaining flexible. Humans are really the only creatures on Earth that, you know, tend to not be flexible and not respond to stimuli in the environment. So for instance, if we've been planning a camping trip for 2 years, bought everything, spent thousands of dollars, and then they announce that the ice age is coming, we will still find a way to go because darn it, we did all this stuff. But if a dog is outside and it starts to wind and hail and rain and lightning, the dog's gonna be like, okay, that was fun, I'm going inside now. So, you know, and there's a psychological term for both of those things, and I can't think of it. But what's that?
Sunk cost, right?
Sunk cost fallacy. Sunk cost. Economic. Sunk cost. Yeah.
But anyway, so the gist of it is that, I mean, for me, it took me a minute to figure out what my routine and my new structure had to be, but I definitely had to create one for myself. And there's no perfect way, and I didn't try to recreate something that was there before, because that isn't going to happen, right? We have to allow ourselves to be messy. We have to grant ourselves grace and self-compassion during this time, and realize that it isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all for every week. Everything is constantly changing. And so, my structure and my routine changes on a daily basis, but I try to adhere to specific values. I try to get out and walk every day. I try to, get some work in. I try to put on my shoes, like for 3 or 4 hours a day. It's really little things: shower, brush your hair, finding little things and finding little wins. I don't think we want to try to recreate exactly how life was, but if we can create some new structure and remain flexible with ourselves about it, I think that's a good place to start. John or Jason, have anything to add?
This is the thing I've been hearing really the most about, and I don't know that it's even related to OCD, although the people with OCD might be having a slightly harder time pivoting to adjust for it, is that we all have a narrative about how our life is going, where we came from, where we're at, and what our plans are. Like you were saying, the plan to go camping, right? So I've had lots of clients with plans for getting married, plans for having kids, plans for starting a new career, a new job, whatever. And it's changed. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't like, we're going to make a slight adjustment to it. You're actually going to be in this office instead of that office or something like that. It's been, the universe has just kind of come in and just said, your story doesn't count. It doesn't count. It doesn't matter. And some people are great with stuff like that. They just naturally go like, okay, so what's the new story? Oh, I'm quarantine man. Okay, I'll be quarantine man. And that's fine. Most people are not like that. And I think people with OCD in particular, they become really attached to their stories, sometimes in a beautiful way, but sometimes in a sort of compulsive way. And so when they're asked to be flexible, they might get really agitated. They might get really lost in anger about the injustice of it all. And they might be so consumed on that project that they don't give themselves new stories to cultivate. So Shira's question about, finding purpose, I think it's not going to be about like, well, learn a new language or something like that. It's going to be more like, well, we'll see if you can start by producing states of well-being and then go from there. See if you can produce a state of adjustment to this new world, adjustment to this new narrative, and start piecing your story back together, and not for the purpose of getting too attached to it, but to sort of make yourself feel whole again. Because I think a lot of us are just flailing about like, what even is reality right now? And again, it's happening to all of us. It's happening to the therapists. It's happening to your neighbors, people in other countries. So anyway, such a long-winded way of saying, yes, I agree with you. We have this tendency to just really be resistant to change, and we've all been forced to cope with a really sudden change. And I don't think you should overcompensate by then, becoming the, master of classical guitar or something like that. Just because you have a couple of weeks where you don't have as much structure as you're used to. Start with states of well-being.
I've been learning ukulele, though.
Cool. So, no, I'm not saying that those are bad things. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you shouldn't do these things.
That's what I heard.
I'm terrible.
Yeah.
But and I don't want to veer too off of intrusive thoughts. But I think it's important to recognize, because obviously on Facebook and other social media, we're seeing a lot of shaming because everybody has sort of a one size fits my way is the right way approach to this whole pandemic. But I think it's worth noting that we are all facing the same struggle, but that doesn't mean that all of our circumstances are the same also. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to be compassionate about everybody's circumstances, whether, and everybody's pain and suffering and struggle are all valid, 100%, whatever that is. We can't, Kim Quinlan always talks about, we can't compare our pain. We can't compare our suffering. It's unique to all of us. I kind of, I don't know if anybody saw the movie Snowpiercer, but I kind of think of it like that, where it's basically a movie where the entire population is on a train. And there's been an ice age, but the train, so we're all on the train right now. The train is the pandemic, and we're all on the train. But on this train, right, you have all these subgroups of hierarchies of status. The back of the train are the poorest people, the front of the train are the richest people, and everybody's having a completely different experience, even though they're all on this train. And I kind of feel like that's our situation now, is that we're all on a train, the same struggle, but we've all got our own unique experience with it. So
that nightmarish dystopia is way cooler than the one that we're actually.
Yeah, it is super cool.
I don't like this one. One like small thing. I just
yeah. No, go ahead, Jason.
I'll just say one small little thing about just rereading Shira's question about just this finding purpose is that your obsessions and compulsions provide sort of a breadcrumb trail to your meaning and to what's valuable to you, what's important to you. You know, there's the reason why it feels important to ruminate or to sort of stay fixated on this is because there's something there that you really care about that's sort of on the other side of that obsession, of those rituals. So I think to reflect on that, and if nothing else, start with, well, this idea that I can't really ruminate myself to a better spot right now. Like I can sit and I can engage in this meeting like for hours a day. I totally could do that. I can indulge, but I can't ruminate with my way to a better life. And maybe even more importantly, more related to the question is that nobody's thanking me for doing that. The more I'm engaging in that kind of a response, the further away I am actually from finding my purpose and from being connected to what it is that I care about. So even though it can feel irresponsible to move away from those thoughts, or even though it feels like back to the sunk cost thing, this idea that, well, but that's what I do. I ruminate. If I have in a situation like this, I kind of spend a lot of time just in my head ruminating. The feeling of that, of kind of like shirking that responsibility is one that I think is sort of worthy of making room for in the meaning of kind of finding that purpose.
Jason, I'm tricky. Go ahead, John.
It just made me think of how we were talking about how OCD is jealous and OCD is greedy, and you just reminded me OCD is also ungrateful. Right, you do all these ruminations to serve the OCD, and it never once says thank you. Now go get a good night's sleep. You know.
I love that breadcrumb trail is kind of mind blowing. I never thought of it that way before. You know, it's because we know that OCD attacks the things that we love most, but your concept is reverse engineer the OCD and use it as a way back to what you're finding, which is so crucial, because I know I was super depressed at my worst, and sometimes it's hard to remember what you value and what you love and what you find passionate, and you know, to turn OCD on itself and use that as a rope to refine it is really kind of brilliant. So
right, well, this idea that like, you know, I can take away your OCD, you just have to not care about your family anymore. Nobody would sign up for that. You know what I mean? So it means if caring about your family, if the other side of it means I'm going to have these, you know, intrusive thoughts about killing them every once in a while. I mean, I do. My wife and kid are watching this right now, and I have all kinds of horrific thoughts that show up for myself. And if that kind of comes part and parcel with my caring about them, then so be it.
Yeah, that's amazing. So at 7:20 p.m., Jared Smith, best way to deal with hyper-awareness OCD, such as breathing, difficult to deal with since it feels like it's with me all day, every day. Exposures, dealing with wishing my life was back to normal. We've definitely had a lot of questions, especially in this COVID era, about hyper-awareness and somatic OCD and around breathing, especially with it being a symptom of COVID itself. So there's a lot of hypervigilance around that. Well, Alison, do you have some thoughts initially?
I'm just nodding along vigorously because I understand. Like when I heard that one of the things was you might lose your sense of smell, it's like I'm going around sniffing and like hoping that I smell really bad so that I can still smell myself. That's all. I relate. That's all.
Jason Statham, what do you think? Yeah, go ahead.
You talking about me?
Yeah.
Jason Statham. Okay, got it. Yeah, I think so. I think with the hyper awareness, so one, I'll just like an initial thought that sort of comes to mind about that. We were talking a little bit before. I think John made a great distinction between what maybe like act alone can look like versus, you know, we kind of were saying they're both. I mean, doing act is doing exposure, but there's this kind of distinction, which I really like that you said, John, before about ERP being more about kind of like bringing it on, and act is kind of like more like a ninja, kind of like ballet, or I don't know, some kind of dance where you're sort of just like responding to what shows up. And I think with the hyper awareness stuff, this is where I think I want to go more towards the act stuff than the ERP stuff. If nothing else, because in my experience, you know, people are so tortured by just this awareness and this like of the sensations or of the, you know, the sounds that you're making and just kind of the experience of breathing. It feels very similar to tinnitus, or I never know how to say it the right way. Tinnitus.
I know tinnitus, tinnitus. The ringing thing, yeah.
Where it's like, you know, the more I'm pushing exposure with that stuff, the more I feel like I'm sort of propagating this idea that we're going to do this, we're going to grind it up into dust, and you're not going to think about it anymore. Like, you're not going to have the sound anymore, or you're not going to like ever think about your breathing again. And it doesn't really tend to work out that way, because it tends to be the sufferer tends to do it in a way so as to resolve the experience, you know, whereas I think the ACT framework here of more whatever your experience, if you notice that you're noticing your breath, so be it. You're noticing your breath, and you may notice it every second of every day, but don't let it change what you do. Engage in what's meaningful to you, and kind of make room for the fact that this is part of your human being experience, is to sort of like have this on your radar. That direction seems to be more useful to me than we're going to sit and we're going to like, deliberately bring the awareness of the breath to a heightened state. Again, because I think it sort of sends the wrong message of what the ultimate goal is.
When I'm doing exposure to hyper-awareness obsessions, my target isn't the content of the obsession, which might be breathing or blinking. It's the identity annihilation that's underlying that. So what we're doing exposure to is, you used to be a person who didn't think about their breathing, and now you're a person who thinks about their breathing. And maybe that's weird and maybe it isn't, but nonetheless, we were talking before about how we're attached to our narratives. Narrative has changed, bro. And so we got to get on that track of like, great, so now you're a person who's thinking about breathing. The people who actually learn to cope well with tinnitus or tinnitus or whatever it is are the people who accept that this is what the world sounds like. The world sounds like this tone, not the world should sound like this other thing, but because I have this problem, it sounds like this thing, and I wish I didn't have this thing. Those are the people who suffer the most. It's the people who say, this is me 2.0. And whatever 1.0 was, it's not so important anymore. So I might be doing some exposures to this idea, maybe through scripting or just through some OCD talkback, of just saying like, maybe I'll think about blinking forever. Maybe this is my new thing. I'm like, Jon Blinker Hershfield, and I just have to kind of get on board with that. And then, of course, yes, the act component of what am I resisting besides that story? The blinking doesn't hurt. The breathing doesn't hurt. There's nothing that's actually has to change other than my resistance to the shift in my attention.
That's great, Jon. Yeah, it's weird to look back learning about OCD. I had breathing, I had blinking, I was constantly bulging my eyes, all kinds of stuff in high school. So I totally relate to somatic, and that's all great advice. So Pammy Lee, hi Pammy, I hope you're well. It's 7:23 p.m. This is going out to Allison. This is an OCD dedication. So I'm trying to understand my 19-year-old son's OCD. His intrusive thoughts are stuck on needing to know what happens once you die. He doesn't show any physical compulsions. Can you give examples of what a mental compulsion would be like? That's great. So she's a parent, seeing her son struggle with intrusive thoughts, but really doesn't know, what an intrusive compulsion looks like. Can you maybe give some insight into that?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't experience quote unquote physical compulsions at all. I guess you could say that avoiding the grocery store could have been a physical compulsion because I was physically isolating myself. But I just had rumination for one thing, like trying to think through the thought to completion so that I could get it right or I could really figure it out. And it's like, if I just think this thought perfectly from beginning to end, I can move on. Trying to undo the thought. So if you have a thought that feels bad, you try to have a good thought to neutralize it. Prayer, any sort of ritual, it doesn't have to be necessarily going through the whole ritual physically, but confessing, whether that's part of prayer or confessing to someone else, confessing to yourself, saying things out loud. There are a lot of ways that it can just be like in your head only, but it's still an issue. And I think reassurance seeking is a big one, or it is for a lot of people. It was for me. So those are a lot of examples, and I know that that's hard, especially for someone who's not going through it, a parent who's trying to see what are they doing. Are they suffering right now? I can tell that they're really suffering when they're washing their hands a lot or when they're turning the stove off on and off a lot. That's something you can see, and you can see like the raw red hands or, examples of that, or hair pulling or skin picking. And with the mental compulsions, it is more difficult because we can become very adept at hiding that. I mean, it already is pretty invisible. And then we can just say like, I have a stomach ache. I just wanted to lie down. I have a headache. It could be a lot of stuff that's going on inside. And I think I don't know if you're asking for advice on how to deal with it necessarily, but just the fact that you're here and, you know, you're looking for advice is a huge thing. And if your son knows that he can talk to you about anything, that's really helpful. And yeah, I mean, that's huge. That's so hard. Wouldn't we all like to know what happens when we die? Like, it's such a huge question with what feels like such dire consequences. It's like, if I just knew, then I would know how to live my life, or I would know if this was all worth it. I mean, it's really hard. So my heart goes out to him.
I mean, I think that's great. I know for me, I mean, when I was 7, I was asking my mom what happens when we die, and I was hoping that mom had the answers. But I think for me, in a simple mental compulsion for me was I was constantly afraid that you know, I accidentally swallowed a bottle of pills as I was taking my medication, and there were mental and physical rituals that came with that. I would count the pills incessantly to make sure exactly the amount were there, but I would then lay in bed and constantly replay exactly what I had done, how I done it, how I took the pill. Did I remember the pill in my mouth? Was it a lot of pills? Was it just one pill? And that constant rewinding and constant replaying to like finally get that level of certainty, to be certain that I didn't actually hurt myself, is the compulsion, that constant rewinding, that constant replaying. And it can manifest in a variety of ways mentally.
Mm-hmm.
Jason,
yeah, and I think like, oh, sorry.
No,
I was just going to say, you know, with some of it ends up feeling physical. So like maybe you're worried that you're sick, and then you're so worried about being sick that your stomach actually hurts, you know, and then you're like, oh my God, I'm actually sick. And, you know, it's just like this cycle.
Go ahead, Jason.
I was going to say, no, I love what you said about, you know, Alison, just the validation piece. Like this is something that we all, I think, struggle with to some extent, right? And would like to know. That's like, when you talk about how to manage it and what to do, especially as a parent, just to start there, right? With especially, well, yes, of course, that is something that is a human being experience to want to know that. Yeah, I was just gonna, a small thing, like all the examples of mental rituals that you guys are giving are great, but just one additional one. We've been kind of talking here and there about rumination here, and I think rumination is a big mental ritual that probably I think we as a field talk about it, but we maybe could be talking about it more in terms of its use specifically as a way to kind of control the inner experience. I think it's harder to catch because rumination isn't always like, you know, with some mental rituals, you know, if you're doing like a mental neutralization or something like that, or a thought replacement, the function is clear. Like, I'm doing this to resolve my anxiety, to make myself feel better. Even just like if you're figuring something out, well, the function is once I figure that thing out, then I'm going to feel better about it. So that's why I'm doing it. But if rumination kind of results in you just kind of feeling like crap, then it's like, well, what's the function of it? Like, why would that be reinforced? Why would I be doing that? And I think maybe like part of the reason why it could be that it gets to this like feeling of it being maybe irresponsible to leave this, like an issue like this, to be undone. So like so here's the thing, you don't know what's going to happen to you when you die. Okay, like I just move on and I keep living my life and let that kind of loose end dangle out there. That feel like, for some of us, that feels, for lack of a better term, just wrong. Like I even if I can't resolve it, and I get that I can't resolve it, I should ruminate on it at least and just lament the fact that I can't resolve this. And that creates an experience. It's like a negative internal experience, but that's like a preferable experience to one where it's like, I'm just going to move on and watch this, you know, basketball game, do whatever it is, and let that go. And that feels just irresponsible or wrong in some way. I think that's just one thing to be watchful of.
Yeah, like I'm going to move on and watch basketball like some monster.
Some basketball watching monster.
Yeah, ooh,
I think when there's a moral component to it as well, sometimes the function of the rumination is really just self-punishment. I have this thought that I did something bad, and there's nothing I can do about it, but I can make myself relive it, or my interpretation of it, over and over again, and squeeze my heart until I know it hurts, and then I know that some justice has been served. So sometimes that's a function of the rumination. Just real quick to the specific question about need to know, and really need to know anything, the primary mental ritual is trying. It's just trying to know, right? When you say you need to know something that fundamentally can't be known, and death definitely falls into that category. Any effort to try to know is the mental ritual. So what's going on in the mind of this person, they're asking for reassurance, as Alison touched on, that's trying to know. But they could also just be ruminating to try to know. Like maybe if I think about it from every possible angle, I'll have an insight burst. They'll be like, okay, that makes sense. Now I've cracked the code and I have the freedom to move forward. So understanding, learning how to watch what your mind is doing and say, oh, I'm trying to know, that's not going to work. I need to not do that. I need to watch basketball or something else instead.
So I'm actually going to scroll down again. If we don't get to your question, please, I will give out we'll put my email address in the thread. Also, I always welcome everybody. There's great advocacy and great feedback. Everybody answering each other's questions, which I love. I do want to bring attention to one thing, which I'm just getting to the thread. It was brought to my attention earlier, but I think it's worth a quick conversation, which is, so I don't know, Jason, Jon, and Alison are aware. So there was an argument that happened in the comment thread where somebody who didn't understand OCD started stigmatizing and shaming someone else that had religious scrupulosity and felt that it was a sin and that there was no such thing as religious OCD. And we were able to block them. For everybody that was triggered by that or upset by that, I apologize. Unfortunately, we can't control who comes in and comments, but we do our best to create a safe place and moderate accordingly. But I wanted to address it for two reasons, because not that I'm looking to reassure anyone here, but I think that one of the sort of shadow fears of OCD is that you don't have OCD and that you really are a bad person. And I think this is one of those examples where somebody comes along and says some mean things and may not understand maybe the seeds of doubt that they're planting. So I really kind of wanted to maybe address what just happened. What's a way that we can healthily advocate for ourselves and our positions. Not that we should engage people like that, but also one of the comments, Jon, is one of the retorts back to this gentleman was somebody quoted you and said, "How can you not believe religious OCD is not a thing?" One of the leading experts, Jon Hershfield, just said there was religious OCD. So I don't know that I have a specific question. I just wanted to talk about it and address it, because I didn't want people to think that we were just ignoring it and pretending it didn't happen, because I think it's a very valid conversation. So please weigh in, guys, where you feel appropriate.
Can I just say that I saw another comment which was disgusting and hurtful, and to Jake, I don't want to call anybody out, but he had a really good question. And it was about like what happened, like how do you do exposure when you have like sexual intrusive thoughts about having sex with your mom? And someone came in and was like, "That's not OCD, you're just a pervert."
Yeah, that was what I'm talking about. Yeah.
No, and no, we're not going to try to do reassurance, but that person didn't fully understand OCD. And I understand that it's hard to understand because there are so many facets to it. And a lot of times, even people with OCD can have knowledge of just their obsessions, and they haven't branched out and they haven't read everything about it like I have. Like I've learned as much as I can about everything, because I think it's so important. And I think eventually we can all have one of those obsessions, and we just can't judge each other for it. But anyone who saw that, I'm sorry, because that really would have affected me horribly if I had been in a really new place or a bad place. I've had sexual intrusive thoughts. Like I said before, incest, religious, like picturing Jesus, child abuse, every kind of sexual thought I've had. And I guess I would challenge you to say, am I a bad person? I don't think I am. So we're all just people trying to make it work. But those are symptoms as well. And I guess in the future, if anyone feels confused about what something might be, like, just probably refrain from saying something and look it up first and make sure that you're not and don't name call. Don't call someone a pervert. Just don't call people names. That's inappropriate.
Jon,
I'm done.
Oh, go ahead. No, you're allowed to go. Jon, what are your thoughts on this?
We were talking before about what's the function of the behavior, like why is the person ruminating? So if we were to do a functional analysis of what would possess a person to go into an OCD support group and shame another person, what's going on for them that would make them want to do that? And I could just make stuff up. I have no idea, right? So what are the first things that come to my mind? this person is afraid of something. And when people are afraid, they do weird things, right? So maybe this is their way of dealing with anxiety, is to go on the attack. Could be indicative of some mental health issue that they have, or could be that the subject matter is so horrifying to them that they can't make a space for trying to understand how a person could have a condition like that. They don't want to understand it because it's painful for them to understand it. So they want to push it away. And, you know, so that's the charitable view. And then there are just people who like to get a rise out of people. But then why would anybody want to do that? Well, you know, they've been hurt before. This is why they want to do it. And it's just, they can't take revenge on whoever hurt them. So, you know, they'll pick on somebody in an online group. So the more I try to think about like this bad person who did this bad thing because they hurt innocent people's feelings, the more I keep coming back up against, yeah, but why would anybody do that? And if you trace it back to the source, it's like, oh man, that's sad. You know, I hope that person gets what they need to no longer have to do that. That's all I can say.
You're a better person than I am on that front right now.
That's part of another conversation.
Such a person.
Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, it does. No, it's great. I think just one thought, just I have on just the other side of it, just the people kind of reading that and being very, very distressed by it. OCD, it's amazing how it kind of wants to make you ashamed of like your humanity, like just being a person. And all these things that we're talking about, these thoughts, like everybody's freaking got them. Like everybody's got the thoughts. I'm sorry,
Right.
like, you got them. Like even just because I just said the thought, so you have it. You know, I mean, they talk about 95% of the it's 100% of the population.
Right.
And
how do you know what the words mean?
Right.
If you don't have
exactly,
the thought?
right, exactly. I just put the thought in your. I put the thought in your head. That person.
Boom, roasted. Yeah.
That person totally just had the thought of his own mom, or whatever it is, and freaked him out. And probably, like John said, it probably creates.
I just had the thought of his mom.
Oh, right. You would know. But yeah,
I told you I'm not a good person.
these thoughts are, but not just intrusive. I mean, any kind of OCD, really. Especially, I run the bathroom habits group at the OCDI, and people, it makes you ashamed of just having a bowel movement. I mean, like you gotta get completely clean. It's like these are natural human functions that we all have, and I think just there's a difference, and just back into the reassurance. There's a difference between reassurance and just education. I mean, this is so much of the function of the IOCDF is education, and just in spreading awareness of what this actually is. And I think I just would want anybody watching. Yeah, it's I think a major component of treatment here is to allow for your humanity, allow for your existence, allow yourself to take up space. And part of that is, you're going to have thoughts that you don't like, and it just makes you one of the rest of us.
Right.
Thanks, Jason. So unfortunately, I'll give it a last. I wanted to get a lot of questions in, but I really wanted to address that because it was an important topic to discuss. And I'm sorry for those of you that were triggered or affected by that. It was definitely unnecessary. And I will say I've been doing these live streams pretty consistently for the last 5 weeks, and that is the not the norm. And I will tell you as an advocate, and I think Alison can say the same thing, and John can say the same thing, and even Jason. But you don't know. You
don't know my story, Ethan.
I don't know your story at all. I know. I just realized that I was saying I don't know what you're dealing with.
You assume anything. No, I'm kidding.
But I think that we've come out as advocates, or we've become clinicians, and 90% of the experience has been pretty amazing, and we found incredible communities, we found incredible support, and the people that have shamed, the people that have stigmatized, the people that have talked down have been few and far between, and that's a blessing. And so I think that being here and speaking your mind and being honest and real and raw and advocating for yourself and asking questions is amazing. Again, that's the first time I'd experienced that in a live stream. So it is definitely the exception and not the usual. So, but I thank you because it also gives us continued conversation about things that we need to address. I know we at the IOCDF, Peace of Mind, and pretty much anyone that cares about the OCD community and breaking stigma works to educate as much as possible. And the key really is to educate with compassion. And I think that's what Jon was heading, really hinting at, is that we don't know everybody's circumstance or situation. We don't know why they're approaching things the way they do. And at the end of the day, when you respond in emotional ways, they won't listen. We have to continue to educate. So when somebody says, I'm so OCD, or that's a little bit OCD, yeah, it frustrates me, but I know that I'll get through to them a lot more effectively if I address it with compassion, caring, and coming from a loving place. And that's the way we continue to advocate. I'll give everybody a last round of thoughts, bringing it back to intrusive thoughts or any of the conversations or discussions we've had tonight. We'll start with you, Alison.
What do you ask? Last thoughts?
Yeah, just last thoughts, wrap up thoughts.
Are you legitimately?
What?
No, education and compassion. Yes. I'm so glad to have been here. I'm glad to have talked about intrusive thoughts to a certain extent. And I just encourage everybody to seek out resources on iocdf.org or to look at books. Jon's books are great. I have never met Jason. You seem like a lovely person and very insightful. So without doing too much and making it become a huge compulsion, just look for support because it's everywhere. I mean, it's something like this, but it's also being in Facebook groups and reading blogs and that kind of thing. And just in general, take care of yourself. This is a really weird time for everybody. It can feel easy to feel like we're the only one going through it because I'm at home all by myself, so it feels like I'm the only person going through it at times. And just give yourself some patience and grace to say, sure, I could write the next great American novel, or I could just binge on Netflix, and that's totally fine if that's what you need to do. And if you need to do something a little more productive the next day, then try to make that happen, but don't beat yourself up.
I'm going to
hopefully
me. Oh, you're welcome, Alison. I'm going to interrupt for 1 second. Jason and Jon, hopefully you have a few minutes, but I just found this and I feel like hopefully Jake is still watching, because I feel like the least we can do is answer his question that he originally tried to ask before he was attacked, and I just came across it. So Jake, if you're still watching, I'd like to address your question. Fine. Apparently Jason didn't want to hear it and he left. So there you go. He was out. Hard 8:30 out for Jason. But that's okay. We don't need him. No, I'm sure he'll be back. Hi Jason, how are you?
What are you talking about me? Just
good. I'm glad you did. So real quick, I just wanted to get to Jake's question because he asked it earlier and obviously we got a little sidetracked. So Jess, it's at 8:16 p.m. Jake asks if I could re-ask my question from before. If I have a sexual thoughts about a family member, what is the exposure? Meaning, how far should I go without having to visualize having sex with my mom, etc.? Jon, why don't you take that to start?
So it's a really good question because there are ways of doing exposure to intrusive thoughts where it doesn't matter what the content of the thought is, and you can go as deep into it as you can imagine, and recondition the brain to understand that this is a story and I don't need to be afraid of a story. I can repeatedly engage with it as a story and behave like it's a story, and then whatever. So I have all kinds of stories in my head and that doesn't matter. But then there are also ways of doing that can create, or at least this is my belief, that can create traumatic experiences. And so something like forcing yourself to have long, prolonged pornographic exposure scripts in your head about having sex with a family member for a susceptible person, that in and of itself could actually be psychologically damaging. Not because it would ever lead to the thought coming true. That's a non-issue. That's OCD junk. But because it could just lead to you really having to deal with way more shame than you have to overcome this disorder. And so when it comes to something like that, obviously I want to do a really in-depth kind of, I want to get a really in-depth understanding of how this person is experiencing this thought, what it means to them. A lot of times it doesn't have anything to do with sexual imagery. And I think clinicians jump right into, well, let's look at these, pornographic images or something like that, pretend it's your mom or whatever. And it might be totally unnecessary or irrelevant because it's not about the imagery. It's about the identity, or it's about some other aspect of the experience. And there's other ways to do exposures to it. So I don't I can't say like, well, here's how you should do exposure to it, because I don't think that would be right for somebody that I haven't evaluated. But what I can say is that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to drag yourself through the muck of the worst version of this exposure over and over and over again, because there is a rule of VRP, which is we actually don't do things that hurt people. We certainly don't do things where we think they're likely to be harmed. And there is some potential for psychological harm in engaging in some of these thought processes as part of ERP. And so we want to be not too careful. It's okay to make mistakes, but we also don't want to jump the gun.
And ERP is a systematic increase, correct? Right, Jason? You don't want to just jump in with the top of your hierarchy and the most intense stuff.
I mean, and mostly the reason why you don't, I think, is because I think there's more likely that people are going to get freaked out and not do the treatment. I think if that, as opposed to it causing, some sort of a harm necessarily. But I agree with what Jon's saying. I think just the one additional point I want to make, it's more about just to kind of emphasize or kind of like reiterate what Jon was kind of just saying about kind of how to think about some of this stuff. I see a lot of, like, sometimes people will ask, well, what's the exposure? Or a lot of therapists do that, I think, with each other. Like, I have this is the OCD presentation. These are the obsessions and compulsions. And now what's the exposures? Give me a list of exposures. And I'm not disparaging that. I get that as a way to sort of generate some ideas. But you really can't answer the question unless you know the person, unless you kind of sat and evaluated them and had kind of and done the in-depth conceptualization and functional analysis. And like kind of like Jon's saying, be able to understand how they relate to those experiences, what shows up for them specifically, if there are implications for identities. Yeah, some people see OCD very much as this separate thing that they have to just deal with and kind of address, and some people see it very much as woven into their fabric, and that plays a significant role in how you're going to conduct exposures, particularly these kinds of exposures that are kind of very sensitive material. So I think that's just like one thing I just want to say is that it's there's certainly not a one-size-fits-all treatment at all. Like, ERP is by far the gold standard, or just doing exposure therapy in general. But I think to really understand what's going to be useful for you specifically, you've got to be working with somebody whose kind of primary initial goal is to understand you as well as they can.
We could also, so I just want to add one note to that. Is like we were talking before about when doing exposure to something might be really overwhelming or really intense, we might start with more of an acceptance model and work our way up to exposure. So something like this, without having to be specific, you could say, well, if you're having intrusive sexual thoughts about a family member, maybe you can just start by just acknowledging, like, yeah, that's the image that kind of popped up on the screen of your consciousness. And all right, well, I had that thought. Let's see if we can just work with being a person who has those thoughts without getting into the implications and pushing it too far.
Alison, anything to add? Last on that.
No, I mean, it made me think of before what I said about We Bear thing, that doesn't necessarily have to be like some graphic script that you go through. It could be, that you're, why am I scared of this? Well, it's not just that, it's because I'm scared of the consequences or whatever.
Perfect. So unfortunately, we are out of time. I will update everyone. Jake wrote, thank you to everyone who backed me up, and thank you to the speakers for acknowledging it. It means a lot. And that is true for Jake, and that is also true for everyone that is on this support group. We are here for you. We are here to back you up and support you, not only during this time of COVID, but during all times, because OCD is a pain in the butt. So as you can see on your screen, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to the IOCDF at info@iocdf.org or call their number. You can always email me at justethan@iocdf.org. I'm a little behind on emails. We've been doing a lot of live streams, but I will absolutely respond to you. Of course, I have to thank my awesome guests tonight, Jon Hershfield, Jason Krompinger, and Alison Dotson, for joining us. Thank you so much for being here and providing just really awesome insight and expertise. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Ethan, I just want to say thank you. So you've been busting your ass like relentlessly
man.
For weeks and weeks doing these things. It's really impressive. So you're doing so much for the community. Like, thank you so much for all the work that you've done. I
sincerely appreciate that, Jason. Thank you. That means a lot. So for those of you, again, I encourage you to go through the comment threads. There's a lot of great comments. There's a lot of Jess. Also, thank you, Jess, behind the scenes. She's been working really hard tonight. But there's some great links and to Alison's website and to Jon's books and to various online support groups. So definitely check that out. If you have a question, I just saw a lot of questions related to COVID directly in OCD. We may have already put this link, but you can go to iocdf.org/COVID-19. There are tons of great resource skills and tools. You can also, people were asking for support communities. I know we put a link to Health Unlocked. So definitely check that out. Last but not least, this Saturday, we will be having our 2 p.m. town hall. It is on social anxiety and isolation as we move to continue to quarantine. I live in the state of Georgia, so we're all going bowling on Friday. We're very excited about that. That was a joke. I am not going bowling on Friday. Maybe some people are.
It's not ERP. That board is not ERP.
No, not recommended.
No, it's not recommended. So you'll definitely want to tune in Saturday. Also mark your calendars. On May 2nd, the next Saturday town hall, we're having an IOCDF State of the Union. We'll be having the executive director, Jeff Szymanski, president of the board, Susan Boaz, and Liz Mackingvale, board member, to update on all things IOCDF. Some big announcements coming, so you won't want to miss that. As always, links to amazing resources, again, through the comments. Thank you to my guests. This is you being proactive and advocating. We really, really appreciate you. So thank you for spending your Tuesday night with us. Oh, I have to do this because we'll get in trouble. What?
It's Wednesday.
It's Wednesday.
Yeah.
Oh, Tuesday.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, right.
That's a sign of the times, isn't it?
Yeah. But if you're on YouTube and you're on Facebook, tap the subscribe button. We'll send you notification and updates on all of the virtual programming that we are continuing to have, not only through COVID, but throughout the rest of eternity. So thank you so much. Stay safe, stay well. Do not let OCD off the hook during this time, and we'll see you next time. Good night.